Welcome to this session on how structural racism works. My name is Richard Locke. I am a professor of political science and also international public affairs, and currently serve as provost here at Brown. Thank you all for coming to tonight's panel discussion, which is the second in the series of how structural racism works, a project being directed by Professor Tricia Rose, based on her research and a project that she's hoping to engage many of you over the course of this year and next year. When I first began as provost about 6 months ago, I set as one of my goals to advance academic excellence here at Brown, and to do so in ways that also built and strengthened community. And I've come to learn over the last several months that central to achieving these goals, both academic excellence and community, to truly and genuinely succeed with these goals, requires focusing intently and deliberately on promoting a diverse and inclusive community. I knew that this was important, and strengthening diversity was a goal that was integral to the strategic plan, the operational plan that we put out in September. But clearly, we were not being bold enough, or deliberate enough, or urgent enough in our actions. And over the last several months, our community has been hard at work developing a plan to achieve our vision for excellence through diversity and inclusion. Now, we have much to do, and there is no question, but I am both energized and optimistic about our potential for progress because we have a solid plan that has been developed by the exceptional students, faculty, and staff that make up our community. Now, at the core of this work is, I think, a commitment to addressing racism and structural racism when and where we see it. For far too many of us, too many people in our community, and certainly beyond the confines of Brown, the realities of racism are all too evident. They exist in large and small ways, in small but painful microaggressions, as well as the obvious and very significant disparities that we see in health, education, and economic opportunities and outcomes. And part of the goals of this series, part of the goals of this major research project that Professor Rose has embarked on, is to share more widely with all of us the many ways in which structural racism manifests itself, perpetuating deep inequality and injustice, and preventing our progress and our prosperity. Now, last semester's launch of this series focused specifically on Professor Rose's work and providing an overview of the gears of structural racism and their interplay. And if you haven't had a chance if you didn't have a chance to attend that lecture, there is a YouTube video that has been seen now thousands of times, and I would strongly encourage you to watch it. It's a really wonderful overview about the sort of framework of this project, of which this panel is part of. This evening, I am delighted that she has brought together just some of the significant scholarly resources that we have here at Brown. Faculty and postdoctoral fellows who think deeply about the role of race and structural racism in their work. Now, while I know that future lectures and workshops as part of this series will draw on scholars from other campuses, and we've tried to advertise already what those sessions will be over the course of the semester, what I think is so important to acknowledge is that Brown already has renowned scholars in our departments and centers like the CSREA, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, the Watson Institute, and a variety of other departments and centers. And I've had a great pleasure to get to know several of our panelists, first as director of the Watson Institute, and more recently as provost. And I've been incredibly impressed by the work that our panelists have done, truly very important cutting-edge research. And so I look forward to what I know will be a very thought-provoking discussion, but that one that I hope inspires us, all of us, students and scholars and citizens, to promote change and to build not only a better Brown, but a more just and peaceful society. In closing, I just want to remark that my experience over the last several months getting to know both Professor Rose and Professor Bogues and many others who have dedicated their careers to this work. And also, over the course of the last several months, delving more deeply into the scholarship, focusing on race and racism, has heightened my own awareness of the depth of these challenges that we face not just here on campus, but as a nation, and that they are deeply connected to this phenomena, structural racism. I believe firmly that as a university, there are things that we can do and that we must do to align squarely with our mission, that we can make a difference through the faculty that we hire, through the scholarship we encourage, through the curriculum that we teach, through the leaders that we help to cultivate, and the policies that we can affect. And this series, which is part of a larger component, not just in this larger structural racism theories, but of so many things that we want to promote over the course of this year and the years to come, is a much larger and deliberate and sustained effort so we can bring about this sustained change. And with that, I want to thank Professor Rose and the panelists for agreeing to this panel and all the work that you're doing here on campus. And thank you all for being here. Thanks.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Thank you, Provost Locke. Is this on by magic terms? Excellent. This is so amazing to see everyone here, and I'm sorry for the people standing in the back. This was the biggest room we could get, and I was a little worried that it wouldn't fill up, but look at this. This is terrific. I'm Tricia Rose, as Provost Locke said, and this is really more of a roundtable discussion, a conversation. I'm loath to have sort of formal presentations, you know, in a sort of conference format. It's really meant to be much more informal, to really contribute to the campus discussion on these issues. It's a very complicated set of issues. There's a lot of, a wide range of positions about it. But we have tremendous strengths here on the campus that I'm really excited to bring together and to have a conversation with. I won't repeat what Provost Locke was saying about the series. You've received emails and there's plenty of information. We just hope to see you in the weeks ahead. But tonight, I'm going to introduce our panelists as quickly as possible because I want to move right to the conversation. And we'll talk for about an hour. Now it's almost quarter of, so maybe 50 minutes. So we have at least 20, 25 minutes for conversation at the microphones, okay? For those who want to just have a quick definition, the operative definition for structural racism for the series that I'm organizing is that it's a normalized and legitimized range of policies, practices, and attitudes. Normalized and legitimized range of policies and practices and attitudes that routinely produce cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. So I'm going to start directly to my right with who we have, and then we'll launch right into the discussion. Jordan Camp, who's an interdisciplinary scholar whose research examines structural racism, neoliberalism, and the policing of urban space. His work aims to extend the scholarly discourse beyond the academy to contribute to public debates, and has just completed his first book, Incarcerating the Crisis, Freedom Struggles, and the Rise of the Neoliberal State, and is co-editing a book called Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, and is a postdoctoral fellow at CSREA and also at the Watson Institute. And to his right is Professor Margaret Weir, who is brand new, who's just, well, not brand new, almost brand new to Brown, and is the professor of political science and public affairs. And before coming to Brown, taught for many years at the University of California, Berkeley, where she held the Avis Saint Chair in Public Policy. She's the author of several books, including Schooling for All, Race, Class, and the Decline of the Democratic Ideal, Politics and Jobs, The Boundaries of Employment Policy in the United States, and is working on a new book entitled The New Metropolis, The Politics of Spatial Inequality in 21st Century America. And to her right is Professor Tony Bogues, who's the Asa Messer Professor. That is definitely a tongue twister. I thought CSREA was trouble. Okay. The Asa Messer Professor of Humanities. I know, it's a rhyme, isn't it? You see, that's what happens to me. Humanities and Critical Theory, professor of Africana Studies, and an affiliated professor in the departments of Political Science, History of Art and Architecture, and MCM. He's the director for the Center of the Study of Slavery and Justice, is a curator, and is currently curating a project in a major exhibition in 2016 on African and Caribbean art. But one of his major research areas as well is thinking about how the historical experiences of anti-Black racism, colonialism, and slavery generated a counter-intellectual, political, and artistic tradition in which fundamental questions of the meaning of being human and freedom are central. He's the author of 6 books, including Empire of Liberty, Power, Freedom, and Desire, and over 80 articles. So join me in welcoming our fabulous colleagues. Oh my gosh, Yalidy. Oh my God, how could I do that? Don't join me in welcoming anyone yet, okay? This is a total brain freeze. Yalidy Matos, my own CSREA fellow and a presidential fellow, mind you, at Brown. I owe you 2 lunches. And her scholarly work examines the intersections between race, ethnicity, and immigration and conceptions of space using a historical and sociological perspective to explain the formation of racialized places and spaces in the U.S. She draws on theoretical frameworks from political science, sociology, social psychology, and history to understand contemporary restrictive immigration policy attitudes among Americans and develop an historically minded theoretical framework that stresses the importance of race and racialized spaces and the more contemporary emergence of imagined borders. Her current book project focuses on white public opinion and its role in shaping immigration policy and tied to historical, deep-rooted issues around race and space throughout public policy. Now, please join me in welcoming our colleagues. Sorry, Yalidy. So I want to start, if you all don't mind, with Margaret and your work on cities in particular. I'm especially really interested if you could just speak to for a moment what you think are some of the significant factors that have gone into play to create the kinds of spatial segregation, disparity, and concentration of poverty based on race and ethnicity that we see in cities all over the country. We see very similar patterns, right? They're different in many ways, but they're quite similar. I'm wondering if you could just share briefly what, the things that you think have defined this kind of experience.
So let me first say this is my first public event at Brown, and I also want to thank Tricia for organizing the Roundtable, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I study inequalities in metropolitan areas, and I'm particularly interested in spatial inequalities, how people are divided by boundaries and how those boundaries come about and what they end up meaning. And there is a large literature. We know a lot about how historically blacks and whites were separated in the United States. There's great historians, including some at Brown, who have documented the use of racial covenants, racial steering, discriminatory loan patterns of redlining. We have a pretty strong literature on this now, that the kinds of places that we think of and that we take for granted, that this is the rich area, this is the African American area, and increasingly this is the Latino area. We know a lot about the role of public policy and the role policy played in creating these places. And yet, exactly in your definition of structural inequality, they have become normalized, that this is just the way it is. And especially what's become normalized are the long-term consequences. And we know some about that, too. We know that variations of wealth by race are very much due with who got to have home ownership right after World War II, who didn't get to have home ownership right after World War II. These are lasting repercussions. And let me say one or two things. The thing that I'm looking at in my work, and that I would also emphasize, is that these aren't just things from the past. They endure because boundaries are so enduring, but they're also being recreated right now. And one of the cases that I'm studying is Atlanta. And many places actually in the South and the Southwest have broader political boundaries that mix people by income more than in the Northeast and Midwest. In Atlanta, there is the Atlanta metro area, there's a huge rush to create lots of independent cities that will essentially allow people to secede from a larger jurisdiction that is run by African Americans. So once Fulton County is run by African Americans and they have generous social programs, you get this move to retreat and to secede and form separate cities. And the thing that is striking is that it is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference tried to challenge that on the basis of race, and they could not win that case. It was seen as, no, this is our local choice. This is local. And that idea that no, local choice is neutral and normal and is not racial, I think is one of the pillars of structural racism that is so hard to combat, and it's now kind of written into a lot of American local law and the whole legal structure of law. Some people might be familiar with the Milliken decision in 1974. It was the court decision that outlawed interdistrict busing. This was about Detroit. Detroit is a place that is kind of, the home of considerable white flight, separate jurisdictions, and the court ruled there's no evidence that these places were created with race in mind. So that is, perfect to your definition of normalizing, so that local is something different from, it's kind of the racial meaning of local is extracted and reconfigured as something neutral.
Right.
So I can go on and on, but
I know that's so important though. And I mean, I think just to follow up on this question of space, because there is this constant re-spatialization based on race in a few ways. And I mean, I'm wondering, we have two specialists on criminalization here in different ways. I'm wondering if, Jordan, you could speak for a couple of minutes about how the expansion of the criminal justice system and mass incarceration extends and sort of compounds what Margaret's talking about in terms of the impact of not just segregation, but the reduction of resources, the constraints applied to given communities.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Good evening. How's everyone doing? Good. I argue in my work, I also have a chapter in my forthcoming book about Detroit, and what I argue is that contemporary carceral policies or mass criminalization has been deployed in response to the demands of the post-war civil rights movement for desegregation. That the most radical demands of the post-war freedom movement were for desegregation of education, for access to healthcare, for access to public transit, for what scholars call social wage. And that to understand mass incarceration and this transformation from where about 200,000 people were incarcerated in the 1960s to where by the 2000s you have 2.4 million people incarcerated, it's productive to think about it as a response to these challenges from below. So let me give you a concrete example of how I think about this. Take Watts, 1965. That was the then largest urban uprising in U.S. history. It occurs within days of the passage of the historic Voting Rights Act of 1965. So at the very moment that you have an old racial regime crumbling, segregation being challenged, the poor and working class people of Watts are protesting unemployment, segregation, police violence, and poverty. As they do so, they compel the leaders of the civil rights movement, including Dr. King, to come to Watts and to meet with the participants in the then largest urban uprising. And he says, I think quite prophetically in some ways, that their struggles were responsible for putting the crisis of structural racism, of militarism, and of poverty on the national stage. When he makes this intervention, I think he is anticipating a shift in politics and economics that will happen from the 1960s to the present that helps us better understand how it is that the U.S. went about the largest prison building project in U.S. and world history.
So to connect to Margaret for a second, so are you saying that in a way the shift was from a kind of explicit language about race and segregation to this kind of implicit private localism, defensive localism, which I understand you to be describing, that now drives a new kind of structural racism?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, what I'm arguing is that the Jim Crow racial regime was thrown into a crisis of legitimacy because of interventions in the courts, because of protest in the streets, and because it was no longer as viable a form of social control.
Right,
And that leads to a new articulation of racism.
right. To get the same results with a different input.
I think so,
Yeah,
right?
So why was the prison industrial complex such a productive place to do that, right? In other words, you know, although I can't think of anything else that would be nearly as draconian as that, so I guess that's one of the answers. But what was the linchpin? How was so much criminality, you know, articulated? I mean, I know Yalidy's work speaks to this, which I'm going to turn to her in a minute, on, you know, turning immigrants into racialized criminals. But first, you got to turn sort of, you know, native-born people as well, right? How does that happen? Why was that so productive?
Well, you know, I think that there's a scholar at Princeton, Naomi Murakawa. She wrote this book that many of you may know called The First Civil Right. And one of the things that she argues that's really compelling is that in the post-war era, increasingly, the racial order is articulated as law and order, right?
Right.
So that opposition to Jim Crow is deemed the source of insecurity, the source of disorder. And you see that by Southern Democrats, and you also see it by Republicans. It's a bipartisan consensus around kind of law and order solutions to social and economic problems. Here's why I picked the events of the 1960s as a kind of turning point in this respect. I talked about the political crisis of Jim Crow. I also think you have an economic crisis. Here's a period where increasingly black people are unemployed, underemployed, never employed. By 1965, when Dr. King goes to Watts, he says, I see conditions for black people that are analogous to the Great Depression, 34% unemployment, right? And so I think that their protest against the conditions that they faced were translated into narratives of law and order and of security. And those justified the building of the prison industrial complex.
And that's a perfect segue to what you're doing, right, in regard to the immigrant community.
Yeah, there's a few moments when I listened to Margaret and both Jordan that I was just like, yes. I was like starting things all over the place. But this idea of, you know, in Margaret's work, looking at sort of spatialization and respatialization, and ways in which political power really is being divided, right? Redistricting, all of that kind of. And in my work, I look at boundaries and borders in the same light, right? The ways in which, you know, you said boundaries are enduring, and that's completely true, right? When we think about the U.S. Southwestern border, how enduring that boundary is, and the ways in which the history of that border really criminalizes Mexicans, you know, contemporary, but the ways in which also, you know, native-born Mexicans in that region of the country really were sort of displaced in their own country in many ways. But also the recreation of boundaries that you mentioned, and the ways in which imagined borders are being created in non-border states like Alabama, like Georgia, like North Carolina, South Carolina, where we've seen a proliferation of restrictive immigration policies in the same ways that, you know, we've seen in the history of this country in terms of what the white-black paradigm. But the ways in which this idea of criminalization really sort of continues in contemporary ways when it comes to immigration in particular. And we see it, for example, in cities where we see, more cities being predominantly Latino, or you have, in New York City, Harlem, which is predominantly African American, and obviously being gentrified a lot more these days. And the argument, and in some ways, this urban space becomes racialized, right? Mm-hmm. So people who are concentrated in Harlem are predominantly people of color, or African Americans in particular, and then you have the racialization of it, but you also have the criminalization of urban spaces and the criminalization of where we see newer immigrants, and the criminalization of those people in particular, right? So if urban is, in contemporary and past literature, really a racialized coded word, which then leads to the criminalization of these spaces and the people, and we see that with the war on drugs in the 1980s and the ways in which urban spaces really were targeted. Drugs were moved in and then targeted. Right. People of color in particular. Right, right. But we see immigration policy more widely really normalize and legitimize the criminalization of immigrants of color, Latinos, and Mexican immigrants in particular.
Right, right. And there was an interesting element to an earlier conversation we had about using sort of what we'd call sort of Mexican racial profiling in ICE raids that were very similar to the kinds of racial profiling practices that we know go on in Black communities. If you just maybe share that for a moment.
Yeah,
and then I'll,
exactly. I mean, ICE as an institution is really interesting. It's been around for a really long time. It's not a new institution. However, post 9/11, ICE completely became just an institution that was beyond the law, above the law. They didn't follow constitutional precedents that sort of said, you need a warrant to go inside a factory and raid it. And in fact, you not only need a warrant, but you actually need a warrant for particular people. You can't raid the whole factory, right? You need 6 warrants for the 6 people you think might be reasonably suspicious or undocumented in this country. Post 9/11, that just went out the door. ICE came into a series of different places in America and just raided the entire thing. In particular, when they go inside different kinds of businesses, not only do they target Latinos in particular, Latino businesses where we know that Latinos work, with a few exceptions, right? So they sometimes target Chinese restaurants in particular and other businesses, but they have workers make lines, right? So they say citizens make a line, permanent residents make a line, non-citizens make a line. They will move on to the citizens line and say things like, you have Mexican teeth, go on that line. Anybody who doesn't look white on that citizens line will be moved to another line. It doesn't matter whether they have a driver's license or a passport. They will make up excuses as to, actually, we don't take driver's licenses anymore. You might have gotten that elsewhere. Your passport is too wrinkled. We're gonna need more. We know that there are harsher interrogations that happen to people who don't look white, to people who are racialized as being in this country undocumented. And one interesting thing about ICE is in 2003, the Bush administration moved immigration from the Department of Justice to the Department of Homeland Security. And that in and of itself lets you know the rhetoric changed, right? There was an ideological shift between immigration being a justice issue and then immigration being a national security issue. And that national security really just masks the ways in which immigration is in fact inherently racial.
Thank you. So, Tony, this is a perfect segue in many ways to the sort of legacy of the criminalization, sort of the big picture of, when Black people go from being property to being free, they go from being, an asset to being a security risk, pretty much overnight. Can you sort of give us the big picture here? Sort of how did we get here around these categories?
Yeah, I mean, first, Tricia, thanks very much for hosting this, and thanks for the provost as well. And thank you all for coming. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that might be important as I listen to my colleagues around the table. And also thinking about your definition, which has normalized as an operative word. And I'm trying to think, okay, normalized really means the construction of a certain kind of common sense. And that construction of that common sense is really about about bodies. It is not just about, we like to think of race as kind of something that's disembodied. You know, there's a racial discourse, there's race, but race is really deeply connected to bodies. And what you are talking about is a way in which there is a racialized body that is treated in a certain way, and where there are discourses and rules and regulations and so on that put that body in a certain place. The history of that obviously is that you have a black body that comes out of slavery. The way that body was classified in a whole set of human classificatory systems, which we can talk about. The way in which those classificatory systems mapped onto certain things. So if you are not Christian, you are pagan, and so you could be treated in a certain way. And then when you had biology with Darwin and Herbert Spencer, the way in which if you were part of the survival of the fittest, you were then degenerate and so on. Or to culture, the way in which if you don't follow certain cultural norms and therefore you are not fit for certain things. And so what I think is important is to begin to think about a common sense that begins to understand that the racialized body is seen really as a body of lack. And always, if seen as a body of lack, then it always has to be treated in some way. It has to be controlled in some way, so it can be criminalized and incarcerated and put in certain kind of positions. It can be treated as an exception. So in other words, you can come to a place and see a group of people and say, okay, this is a certain kind of body. I can treat it. I don't have to treat it with the normal procedures of law. I can treat it in a certain way, so it can be treated in a certain exception. And that has always been so historically. Always historically, the laws and customs of this country have treated black bodies as bodies that can be treated with a certain kind of exception that does not have to follow procedural equality. But I think that it is also important to think about those bodies and the way we think about race and racism as also having I think as I said this to you on the phone, a visual component. So when I listen to her, for example, to somebody say, but listen, your teeth look Mexican.
Yeah.
Right? That is part of it is common sense, but part of it is a common sense that comes from a certain visual understanding. So what is of a certain physiognomy? In other words, this is how you're supposed to look. And so one then has to ask the question, at what moment did we begin to have a certain way of thinking about human beings in which racism became the ways in which you understand difference, right? And so just trying to think through it, that it might be useful for us to think about that there's a way in which anti-black racism historically that emerges at a certain historical period actually creates race. In other words, we have a way of thinking that race creates anti-black racism. It might actually be the other way around. It may be that the way in which anti-black racism, as it begins to emerge and develops and works through biology, religion, and so on, in fact becomes a way to codify human beings in racial categories. Right. Because once it then begins to do that, then it codifies there's white folks who are then race. Right. There are Chinese who then become, everybody then becomes a race. Right. So there's, and what happens when everybody then becomes a race is that you then begin to have a certain classificatory schema in which you then begin to understand some people as this, some people as that, some people have this characteristic, some people have that characteristic, some people, and so on, which then lands us into a dangerous thing, I think. And also then just to say with one more and then I will stop, is that I think that becomes important because there's a way in which in medicine and in genetics, when you begin to read that literature, what becomes really important is a way in which race there are health disparities that we know according to race. We know that, and we can document that. But there's also a way in which people are thinking about genetics and what, in fact, what black people are supposed to have, what is the white folks are supposed to have, what Mexicans are supposed to have, what this group was supposed to have. In other words, to construct a set of characteristics based upon a certain popular notion, the common sense, the normalized notion of racial categories, which then becomes, quite frankly, dangerous if you're trying to think about medicine and how you treat people, but also become very dangerous in terms of just genetics and science itself.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this idea of the binary really is an important one to understand structural racism, and in that sense, I completely agree, right? To have white, you need the opposite of that. You need the binary, right? You need the reference point, right? So if white means good, then you need to codify and racialize what then is the opposite of that. In the immigration sense, there's scholars who argue this, but in particular, a forgetful nation, Ali Badad, who says the immigrant is needed because it is the reference point to the citizen, to American, right? If somebody is American and somebody's citizen, then you need the reference point, right? You need the other side of that. What does it mean? And if American equals white and citizen equals white, then immigrant is non-white, right? Immigrants is the opposite of that. And so in order, the ironic part of that, right, is that not only do you need a reference point, but you institutionalize that cycle so that the reference point will always be there, right? Because you always want to say American equals is better. So you're always going to want the reference point to say this is why it's better, because look at these people.
The collapsing of two reference points at once: whiteness with goodness, immigration not.
Right,
and therefore not white.
Exactly.
Even though in fact that's not the case. It's not about reality. It's about the way the categories are operating.
And it's the way in which particular bodies, just like you were saying, are racialized. Particular bodies are marked with racial terms and racial meaning.
But at the same time, these references have sort of dropped out of the public conversation in many ways. I mean, they're everywhere, but as when Margaret began, there was, and Jordan was talking about it too, this kind of arc, the end of a Jim Crow logic when you could explicitly talk in these racialized terms. There's no question they're still quite operative, but the dog whistling, the creation of alternative frameworks to obscure this relationship so that you have defensive localism and individual rights and community freedom, and you can have as we talked about, the bar is so high for proving legal discrimination. It has to be intention. You have to hold really almost a 1940s attitude about race in order to be held accountable. So there's a bit of a contradiction here, though, isn't there?
On the surface it looks a contradiction, but this is what I would suggest, that there's a way in which what Jordan says is absolutely correct. There's a new conjuncture, civil rights, the collapse of Jim Crow regime and so on, means that explicit racialized discourses, except for a few people, crazy people, are simply not on the cards. But what is still on the cards is the popular notions, is the common sense. This common sense does not go away. The common sense has not radically shifted its coordinates. And so what you then have to do is to find a way in which, within the social formation, this common sense can be do what Stuart Hall would call, be re-articulated within the actual interstices of the society itself and the various elements of the social formation. So that the re-articulation doesn't have to now say, Tricia, okay, it is because this is a black person. The re-articulation can be, this is local business, right? Yeah. But within that, under that cover of local business, then every local business then becomes the code for, we don't want certain bodies inside here, right? And we need to set up certain boundaries. And so that it is therefore trying to understand how the things are now re-articulated but carrying a certain content of racialization and anti-black racism. That is one of the tasks, I mean, that I think one wants to think about. And so that in trying to think through colorblind racism, people say to you, I mean, no, I mean,
I don't see race.
I don't, you don't have to see race anymore because the things has been so normalized that it is actually part of your common sense without you thinking through. I have to overthrow that common sense in my head, right? And this is really one of the toughest things because people say, well, you know, I have 100 black friends. What is your problem, right?
Or just one.
Yeah, you know.
You've gotten all the way up to 100, Toby? That's pretty good.
You just need one these days.
But and I understand. I feel your pain, sort of thing. No, you don't, right? Simply because there is a way in which the actual experience of having that racialized body, whether it is Mexican and black, invokes or carries with it a certain experience, right? Where which becomes, I mean, the phrase I really like, there are two phrases that I really like to try and understand this. One is by Du Bois from 1903, that there is a veil, right? And that there's a veil to black life that still exists, even though there is a black middle class, right? Of which, you know, a lot of us don't, you know, here also. But there is a veil still to do with black life. And secondly, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Because there's a certain way in which that black life, particularly black life of poor black folks, become invisible, right? Or if it doesn't become invisible, it is then seen as a part of a kind of, I mean, my good friend Orlando Patterson has written this, you know, huge book about the cultural matrix. The cultural matrix is about trying to have a set of cultural explanations about why it is that black youth behave in a certain way, without any kind of understanding, in my view, of a set of ways in which structural, what you would call structural racism operates. Right. So I mean, you know, I mean, there are those things that operate that I think one just needs to be, you know.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the culture in a minute, but I'm going to leave that for a moment. Go ahead, Yalidy, and then did you want to find?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the work that I do in some other political sciences, there's this sort of measurement of modern racism, which is in fact what Professor Bogues is sort of explaining, this idea of symbolic racism, right? And it's cultural based, right? So the fact that, you know, blacks just can't get enough, just can't get like social mobility because they just don't work hard like other groups in America. You know, slavery really isn't an issue anymore now that we have equal opportunity. And equal of opportunity really is one of those words where it's masking the racial, right? So what does that even mean? Equality of opportunity, but nobody really talks about equality of results. Yeah, we may have the opportunity to all come to Brown, but if we didn't start at the same place, right? If I didn't go to a private high school, if I just went to the underfunded, under-resourced New York City public high school that I went to, you know, is that starting at the same place? And that's equality of results. That's what we have to move forward into thinking, but you have a lot of people who sort of say, no, now we have equality of opportunity, and that's in the ways in which it's being masked. So it may not be explicit anymore, but it's symbolic in many ways. And you have that with immigration as well, where people talk about immigration as a national security issue, right? Immigration in economic terms. You know, we just are so worried about the jobs that I don't even work in. You know, like I'm not even in that industry. I am not even part of the working class or the class, you know, lower than that. But I'm worried about the jobs, when it in fact is it's about race, but nobody says that, right? Because it's easier to say immigration is about national security, and then we can racially profile, right? Arizona can pass SB 1070 and racially profile Latino immigrants because it's about national security. Alabama can do the same because it's about national security. We are so worried economically, but we see time and time again that economic variables are just not significant.
Right. But there are, absolutely. There are, though, and I'm wondering, Margaret, if I can bring you back in here, because I think that while there are places where one could claim objective legal equal opportunity, there are actually many cases where we could say there isn't equal opportunity, right? I mean, it sort of both are going on simultaneously.
Yeah,
so I just want to,
before
we get to the culture.
Going back to this, you know, metropolitan divisions, the notion that there's equality of opportunity when you look across what does the public supply in different parts of the metropolitan area? Entirely different.
Right.
You know, one of the things that we have now that is increasingly growing are poor suburbs, poor African American suburbs, poor Latino suburbs that in some ways haven't even fewer resources than cities do because they have less
Right.
of an economic span of people in those places. Basic things like libraries, like getting the roads paved, like Flint, Michigan, clean water. If cities where poor people live and that are disproportionately African American in the United States cannot supply water that won't poison people, and we can't understand how that happens, then there's something wrong with our categories for understanding how things happen. So, I mean, I think that the idea, I mean, I don't know who thinks we have equality of opportunity. I don't know who they are, but I mean, if you look at if you look at schools across the United, I mean, on every single measure, you have to say that there is not equality of opportunity in the United States, and we have built it into the way we grow up, the way we think about who has what, the way we go some places and don't go other places, the way public transportation goes, the way it doesn't go. One of the things that I look at is transit racism, and people are interested in, especially as you get more low-income people spread throughout metro areas, how do you get to jobs?
Right.
In Chicago and Atlanta, disproportionate numbers of African Americans who are lower income live in the southern suburbs of those places, and the jobs are all up in the northwestern corridor. And there is no transportation that goes there. And there is resistance. I have to say in Atlanta, it's actually not hidden. It's kind of out there. It's not really hidden racism. It's, you know, it comes pretty close to the surface about why people don't want public transportation. But that kind of connectivity, I mean, that's been an issue with public transportation. I mean, of course, that's where Rosa Parks started, was challenging public transportation. But, you know, if you've tried to get to the metro in Georgetown, it doesn't go there. Why is that? Well, there's reasons for that. So, I mean, these are things that are, you know, they're as concrete as you can get.
Yeah.
They're like highways and
Yeah,
subways.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Jordan. You want to? Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to take up on this point about a kind of re-articulation of a racist common sense, and I think it's a helpful way to think about the naturalization of the rise of mass incarceration and of what scholars call a neoliberal turn in public policy. And I like to think about these two problematics together. I think that we have a situation where on one hand, right, we're in post-racial America, right? We're no longer supposed to have explicitly discriminatory policies, yet we have racial inequality all around us. For example, right, the US incarcerates more black people than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. How do we resolve that kind of tension, right? And I think what, you know, the comment about a common sense is kind of, it's so taken for granted and natural that of course more black people are supposed to get locked up. Of course, you know, they're more subject to crime, and that's the reason they get arrested and the rest, right? I mean, this is the, I think, racist common sense you're describing. But I want to push it just one step further and say that it's not, we have to look at our role in the university and look how even many social scientists, journalists, and scholars have helped produce this common sense through a discourse of an underclass, right? That purportedly is the source of disorder in cities, the source of urban social problems, right? And that narrative of an underclass, which is the source of insecurity, of chaos, of criminality, of lawlessness, which is a purportedly colorblind narrative, has, I think, simultaneously disavowed racism and naturalized the buildup of the largest carceral state on the planet. how did that happen? What's the relationship between the buildup of these carceral policies and neoliberalism? I think it happened like this. Those narratives of an underclass have said that access to education, access to health care, access to kind of social programs should be eliminated, should be restricted in the name of balancing budgets and the rest of it, right? And those resources should instead be redirected to the expansion of policing, of prisons, and of urban security. So I think if we're going to have a conversation about how to undo structural racism, we have to think about its simultaneous disavowal through these common sense languages of security and law and order to control an urban underclass.
Yeah.
I think this idea of
Very
control
nice,
and policing really ties back to structural racism and what that is, and the normalization of it. And the sad part, right, is that it becomes normalized. This hyper controlling, hyper surveillance, violence against people of color in particular becomes normalized and accepted. I think ICE raids, is one example where people, armed, SWAT-looking ICE agents come in, and people are just like, yeah, great. Or some people are like, they conform to it or are complicit with it, right? And they start pointing fingers. It's a very normalized way, and we see that in the borders, right? The ways in which the U.S.-Mexico border has been normalized and has been, controlled in a way that other, the U.S.-Canadian border, for example, isn't, and the ways in which it has been racialized. And to give you one really telling example, 2001, what happened then, right? 9/11. In 2001, there were 9,061 agents at the U.S.-Mexico border. We know, right, post 9/11, that there were no, so-called quote-unquote terrorists who came in through the U.S.-Mexico border. There were 324 agents at the U.S.-Canadian border, which now we know there are some who did come from the U.S.-Canadian border. And that just tells you the disproportionate ways in which, race plays a role in where we see Border Patrol agents, where we see this control of bodies and what kinds of bodies.
Right. So everyone has started touching on the bugaboo of culture. I knew it would seep in because you can't have this conversation without really dealing with it, which is to say, why do we have these disparate outcomes, right? There are largely two arguments. The one we're all making here, which is, from different perspectives, but mostly focusing on structural conditions, past practices, contemporary practices, policies, ideologies, invisible structures, narrative denials, etc. But there's a strong, cohort of social scientists, some who invented the underclass, others like, you mentioned Orlando Patterson, but he's not alone, who want us to focus on culture. So I'm going to lay out in 2-3 sentences the argument, and then the floor is open for engagement. So the argument is basically that even for those who believe that structures in the past caused problems and it's created circumstances of inequality, the idea is that those evolved into behaviors among the underclass and the poor and the marginalized who are black and brown, and that they now behave in ways that generate the outcomes that they face. So that although there may have been structural constraints in the past, this would be sort of the Moynihan Report's argument from the 1960s, that those past structures that we can't deny are now replaced by behavioral actions that reproduce negative outcomes. So very specifically, if Black and Latino kids were more interested in education, if Black kids would pull their pants up, if, so-and-so would, put on their slippers, and fathers would, Obama was constantly on Father's Day. His whole presidency, I was thinking Father's Day was my least favorite day because he was going to launch into a speech insulting Black fathers, but all the other fathers were just completely, scot-free. So, the idea would be, teach your kids, you must, therefore you don't teach your kids. There's a kind of crime and poverty and violence, black on black crime is logical in a segregated world, becomes a cultural matter. It's not just so what do we do with this phenomenon? I mean, it seems that no amount of evidence, we could be here for hours with statistics and data, and, you know, it would not prevent the cultural framework from having traction. What do you think about this cultural framework? What would you say to the proponents of it? And, you know, anyone else who wants to pipe in on how we can negotiate it. I will say very quickly up front, I think culture matters to some degree. I think we don't want to make an argument that it doesn't matter what your behavior is. But the question of behavior trumping the level of structure we're talking about seems staggeringly impenetrable. Okay, floor's open. Culture is on the table. Culture's been dropped.
I don't study culture at all, so maybe I should start. Sorry. But so this is just kind of on the side of this issue, but I think it relates to, I don't know maybe it relates to culture. The thing that I have found really interesting is that now there is this recognition that white people have drug problems, that there's a heroin epidemic, and that something needs to be done about it. And I have been so struck by the kind and gentle, compassionate, we need drug treatment. It is just so amazing at how different the debate has been about heroin than it was about crack. And I was there, you know, I was at Brookings when the super predator language started, all that stuff. People didn't talk about, you know, there's a, you know, people are, it's a disaster. People are getting addicted to drugs. It was exactly this kind of culture. I find this juxtaposition of these two things right now so illuminating, and I do wonder if something positive could come out of it.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, anyone? Tony? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that there's what passes as a cultural argument really, in my view, harkens back to an old social sciences argument of the 1950s about behavior. When we were thinking about the social sciences as essentially behavioral sciences before it became popularly known as social sciences. And when we thought about it as behavioral social sciences, what we thought was, how could we study human behavior? And the study of human behavior was seen as disembodied from actual structures and causes and various, you know, what Stuart would call a certain kind of way of thinking about a social formation and the relationship of each part of the social formation to the actual, what then constitutes the society itself. Because what I would want to suggest is that there are a couple of things operating. One is that the structures of racist society still operate even if they do not use the same language of Jim Crow racism. Mm-hmm. Right? So that therefore there is structural racism that is still operating. In housing and, you know, in education. I mean, we just, you know, we know in jobs and, you know, we know that, right? And so that when you can then begin to think about, okay, this young man should pull up his pants and the father should do this and so on and so forth, what you are ignoring is actually the actual conditions of the society itself, which have been reproduced in different ways. And then what you are doing is focusing on a group of people who are now, who you know think are a problem. I mean, there is a way in which, the way I like to think about it sometimes is that, you know, the opening lines of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks, written in 1903, is how does it feel to be a problem? And that's how he begins. And I think to myself, yeah, okay. What happens is that we have then constructed an analysis in which these young men and young women are the problem, without any kind of reflexive analysis about what the society may be and what it is that we may be doing, to not to produce the problem, but to create a certain situation where certain outcomes are inevitable, like the night follows the day. And so that to me, to think about the culture argument is there's two things. One is behavioralist. Two There's three things there. Two is to think about culture, quite frankly, in a very narrow way.
Right.
All right? It's to think about culture as simply a behavior rather than to think about culture as a certain kind of complexity of practices that human beings actually carry out. So that, and to also then think about the ways in which, pulling up your pants or whatever is not really the marker of certain things.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at young men. I mean, I have young men who I'm very fairly close to, who wear their pants in a certain. Everybody has a master's degree, and some of them are going to a PhD. Yeah. What am I going to say? Pull up your pants? No, right? No. So I mean, the point I'm making is that there is a way in which we take signs and symbols and read them off in relationship to a certain common sense that we have.
Right.
Because I would argue that the actual reading off of these kind of bodies that need training and so on is actually a reading of lack. It's a reading of lack, that these bodies are lacked and these bodies need to be civilized and these bodies need to be contained and that there need to be some kind of uplift, right? Yeah. And rather than thinking through what are the set of conditions that one might need to do to transform a society so that these folks can feel that they're part of the society. Because part of it, I would argue, and you know it better than I, is a certain kind of alienation. And, and how does the alienation emerge?
Yeah.
It's not imaginary.
Yeah, no. In fact, one could make the case that, that drive to render one, abject and lacking and absent, the incredible will to make oneself visible, right, is very powerful. Yeah. Even when that is done in some cases in ways that might be self-destructive in the context of the social structures as we know them. But that human will is incredibly powerful. It's like it gets more and more visible on its own terms. It refuses, right?
It's a refusal.
A tremendous amount of refusal. Yeah.
I thought the same thing when you mentioned like invisible man and you're either invisible or hyper visible. And I think the cultural argument is one of those hyper visibility moments. And part of the issue with cultural arguments is that they work at the aggregate, right? So these people behave this way versus, I saw one individual who might have needed to pull up his pants. And then that becomes a stereotype about the entire group. And that's where, cultural arguments really fall apart because they work based on stereotypes. But part of why cultural arguments are in place is because of the disavowal of racism. It's given a justification of the denial of racism, right? So racism doesn't exist. It's actually culture, right? It's actually, there's something about these individuals, about their behavior. It's their fault. They're in poverty because, they just don't work hard enough. And that allows somebody to deny racism and deny structural racism in particular. And at the same time, right, they don't have to say, we're actually really invested in whiteness. We're actually really invested in continuing the status quo. And so because we don't have to say that anymore, we deny racism and just blame it back on other individuals. And to bring a gendered perspective into this, we see a lot of that goes on when we think about welfare and the ways in which welfare is a racialized coded word. And we think about Black women and women of color in particular. In terms of immigration, we think about anchor babies, right? The hyper-fertilization of immigrant women and coming into the United States just to have babies that are US citizens, and the ways in which gender and culture really do intersect and dehumanize and demonize women in ways that either make them invisible and less human, or hyper visible and hyperly sexualized in ways that are not, work against them.
Exactly.
Can I say just one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
That because I wanted to connect it to Jordan's point about neoliberalism, because I would think that one of the things about culture, and it, is what you said that jogged my head about this, is that there's a way in which in the neoliberal argument the individual now becomes key.
Yep.
Right? In other words, there's not so much anymore public, there's always this private. So the individual becomes key, and he or she really has to pull him or herself up by the bootstraps. And so that what you then have in the cultural argument is a reinforcement of this, so that it is a lack of individual achievement of these people, and you then all of that is then mapped upon a certain kind of historical way in which you think about people who have lack and so on and so forth. So I would want to say that what then added to the racialized common sense that I've spoken about is a common sense about that is a dominant common sense about individuals and individual achievement.
Right.
All right? That is disembodied from groups of people and structural relations.
Right, absolutely. Jordan, I'm going to have you comment, and we're going to throw it open to questions soon, so if those of you are interested to start moving to the mics, just to give you a advance notice. Yeah, go ahead, Jordan.
So I think in terms of the cultural kind of narrative, the ways that it's articulated is through a culture of poverty. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to pick up on both the comments about, on one hand you have kind of images of a welfare queen who has, access to welfare programs, and that does a lot of work. It calls up images of women of color having, disproportionate access to welfare, which of course displaces the reality of the fact that the majority of people, of course, on welfare are white. I think this culture of poverty also calls up a kind of narrative of a violent Black and Latino male that's a threat to order and security. And this has been conjured up again and again in the wake of urban unrest, from the late 60s to LA in 1992. And one concrete way in which this construction of a culture of poverty as a source of problems has made its way into public policy and a part of the neoliberal turn is you look at Bill Clinton's election. He gets elected the same year as the Los Angeles events of 1992. What's his first thing that he does when he comes into office? He pursues the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, right? It was signed into law in 1994. It included funding for more than 100,000 more police, 4,000 border control officers, prison construction, and the expansion of capital punishment. He did this at the same time as he pushed what he called, to use his term, the end of welfare as we know it. Right? So again, this image of the welfare queen, right, caught on these anxieties of people of color having too much access to social programs that actually legitimated the destruction of the welfare state for working class people as a whole and the construction of the carceral apparatus.
Right.
I think when we're thinking about racist ideology and the common sense, we have to think about its implications for, as Tony says, the social formation as a whole. One last point about this, and that is that when we think about the elimination of welfare and this expansion of carceral apparatus and of workfare, we need to see it as direct. In other words, we have people thrown off of welfare rolls and into the prisons.
Right.
Under Bill Clinton's administration, in 2 terms, 700,000 people went to prison, okay? It went from about 1.2 million.
That's 3 times more than were in prison in the 60s. You said
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it was 200,000 in the 1960s.
700,000 more.
More. And check my figures on this, right? So when we're thinking, I guess the last point I want to make is when we're thinking about this common sense and we're thinking about a culture of poverty, we're thinking about the neoliberal turn, I think we need to see it as a bipartisan political project.
Absolutely, yeah.
Around prioritizing security, right? Because if we want to think about, again, confronting structural racism today, I think we have to think about it the way it's articulated through notions of security, a floor beneath which particularly whites cannot fall. But people of color are to be maintained, in the unemployed, in the ranks of the unemployed, in the prisons, as being deported. In detention centers, and the rest of it, but not in the welfare lines, not in public schools, not in public employment.
Right, excellent. Thank you, Jordan. Okay, let's throw it open for a dialogue. I'm just gonna go. I go left and right, except there's a shorter line, so we'll see what happens. But please go ahead and tell us your name briefly.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I always should I when I ask the question, do I stay at the microphone? A part of me wants to run away after I ask it.
Whatever makes you feel better.
I'm just gonna try to stand my ground.
All right.
So this is to everyone on the panel who deals with kind of like urban spaces and like how racist policies have created these neighborhoods. I think something really relevant to anyone who's college age in the room is like gentrification, and how you have like all these kids who are graduating like either college or graduate school, and they're moving to places that have lower prices, and in doing so you're seeing a massive push out of people who were stuck in these neighborhoods in the first place because of policies like redlining, and now they can't, they're being kicked out of the only places that they could afford. And is there like, what is in the talk for like ways that you can kind of reverse that process of like gentrification?
Great, that's a great question. What I think I might do is not have everyone answer every question. We'll be here a very long time, so I'll just pick and choose because I know them. Okay, Jordan, I'm picking you for this one. Okay, very quickly.
What do I have to say about gentrification?
Well, not just about gentrification, but about what can a person in her situation do given the sort of structural circumstances. What she can afford when she comes out of school.
My mentor and our colleague George Lipsitz talks about learning to listen, listening to learn. And I think in this context, there are social movements around the country, including ones in Providence, and I see representatives here from DARE that work on gentrification and policing. If you look in cities like New York, across the boroughs, there are grassroots organizers who are fighting from Chinatown to Brooklyn to New York to prevent displacement, to try to get rent control. So I think that if you look in Los Angeles, at the Los Angeles Community Action Network, the most gentrifying area of downtown, they've been trying to prevent the destruction of low-income housing, the destruction of single-room occupancy hotels for low-income renters, and fighting against the criminalization of the racialized poor that's part and parcel of gentrification. So I guess I would say is we have to learn to listen to the insights and interventions of social movements in cities around the country that are confronting this process and offering us important policy interventions and ways to plug in. So if that helps.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nancy Kalick. Thank you all for your comments. I guess I just wanted to offer a thought and maybe contribute to a small part of the conversation about how to deal with the fact that in spite of massive amounts of evidence, the pervasive notion of culture as a causal explanation for situations and circumstances persists. And I wondered if any of you had thought about what might be available from the critique of Orientalism that has dealt with this kind of totalizing and determining notion of culture as a kind of a dehumanizing mechanism to label certain populations as having an inevitable predisposition to a certain kind of behavior, which ties into what a lot of you have been talking about with this concept of naturalization, not just of particular norms, but almost a biological sense of naturalization, in that suspicion and malice and almost superhuman qualities are attributed to certain kinds of racialized bodies, particularly young male ones. And I'm thinking of examples like the abnormal amount of bullets that go into killing young black males. It's like they think they're superhuman and their bodies are somehow bulletproof. Or the idea that children are more predisposed to commit acts of terror if they're Syrian, right? So we hear this in the discourse about refugees. And phrases that are positive in some contexts when referring to certain people are completely negative. So Carly Fiorina can refer to able-bodied men who try to get in as refugees, but the able-bodied men in the Oregon militia are left kind of alone. And just thinking about how that kind of, not even the criminalization of behavior, but the criminalization of the potential to commit behavior because of what your identity is. Yeah. So that a 12-year-old who brings a clock to school gets the SWAT team, but we kind of take a wait-and-see approach with Clive Bundy, right? So it's not even the criminalization of behavior anymore, it's the criminalization of identity. Right. And it sort of speaks to that inevitability of the culture that one is supposedly a part of, that will force them to be, regardless of whatever their intentions are, and even regardless of whatever their circumstances are, they are genetically predisposed to act this way. And the critique of Orientalism, although it sort of lives in universities and hasn't really affected policy, which is why all the legal stuff is important, offers a way to respond to that by calling out how dehumanizing that totalizing and determinative attitude is. How that translates into policy, I'm not really sure, I haven't seen it, but that's just
Okay.
what I had to offer.
Thank you, Nancy. Sounds like you've answered this question. I don't know if we can really quickly add more to that. If someone has anything quickly, it was great. Then if not, I'm going to move to the next question. But Tony, did you look?
No, the only thing I would want to say is that there is a way in which culture and biology and culture and genetics are mapped together.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so what you're
Right.
saying is absolutely correct.
Yeah. And I haven't seen much on Orientalism getting connected this way, so that's an interesting connection. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Antoine Matthews. I'm actually a visiting student from Tougaloo College, the partnership that Brown University has. So I have a question, suggestion, kind of flows. Okay, how do we create a space to have a conversation with white ethnic groups? I ask this because some of my scholarly readings in my culture and health lecture forces the white ethnicities to see the harsh reality of their history. I took notice that they feel guilt because of their ancestors. As a brown and Native American individual, I don't want pity. I want justice, understanding, a true conversation. My biggest fear isn't how white ethnicity groups feel about me. My biggest fear is not knowing how they feel about me. Colorblindness has become normalized in today's society as a result of avoiding these conversations. These cause fury amongst the underserved communities. How do we create an atmosphere to actually talk and address the issues at hand? It's not guilt that minorities need, it's a solution to be on equal grounds in every human endeavor. When will we remove this veil that separates us and create a solution to embrace us?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm actually going to take this question, if that's okay. Because I've done a number of talks and spent a lot of time talking about this question of guilt as this impediment. And one of the underpinnings of the project that this lecture series and panel series is connected to is to figure out how to convince the vast majority of people, not just whites, but mainly them, significantly, to see how structure and ideology are working together to reproduce this, personal beliefs in equality notwithstanding, right? So you can have 95% of whites believe in racial equality as a principle, many think we're already there, and you can give all the evidence in the world about how it's not there, and you get two things. One, you get culture. Well, if they acted better, they could take advantage, or you get guilt. And there was a very provocative case very recently about this where the African American Policy Forum's short video on racial inequality and opportunity was responded to with outrage at a school. They showed it at some diversity event. It's been out for a while and it's been showed all around the world. It's by no means provocative, but it talked about racial inequality. And so a small group of very vocal parents called it the white guilt video, and that they were not going to let their kids see it. They didn't want to have it. So this question of how do you have this conversation, it is painful, it's difficult, right? Because you're dealing with people's identity formation. I mean, and that's the hidden question around whiteness as an invisible form of identity that structures invisible privileges, right? They're invisible until you start trying to take them away, like extend the bus system, or, then all of a sudden, you get a different conversation. But doing that in a way that says, look, people are going to be invested in that which society invests in, right? So to sort of separate it from personal intent and malice, except for the clump that actually has that belief, is going to be really crucial, it seems to me. And that is about saying, look, we're all responsible for creating the world we want to create. So we have to take responsibility for where we are in it and move toward it, and really get out of a kind of hostile, assuming negative intent attitude and perspective. So I mean, I think we have to confront guilt head on, but at the same time, not let ourselves get wrapped up in it, because it can be totally disabling. Yeah, thank you for that, and welcome. Yes.
My name is Abbas Noor. I'm a third-year medical student at Brown. And third year is your crash course on teaching hospitals, which have a storied history of the practice, and I underscore practice of medicine on poor and black bodies. But in this time, I've realized that a lot of the data that we run, and I love the fact that you guys use the word normalized, because it's normalized to white bodies. For example, pulmonary function tests have a corrective factor for black people because they have bigger lungs, which is a remnant of slavery. But also renal function, which is a holdover from a time where people thought that black people just had more muscle in their bodies, and so their kidneys functioned at a higher rate. And it's a largely conservative institution. So my question is, how do you move away from the way that we normalize data in medicine to white bodies in a profession that does not have avenues for referendums or laws or
Yeah.
so on?
Yeah.
Thank
Wow,
you.
that's a great question. Thank you. And even gender, they test drugs on men only, and then they find out 80% of drugs that fail because they harm women. It's like maybe. Anyway, this is mild aside. Anyone want to take this question? Margaret?
I would just say, I mean, you know, one of the things that all these advances in genetics, in a way, are helping us understand how individual our genetics are. So to then go to clumping things by race, in a way, is moving in an opposite direction from what advances in genetics have to say. And one thing I think is quite interesting is the role of pharmaceutical companies in marketing drugs and marketing the idea that there should be specific drugs for specific people. So I think there are forces out there trying to reinforce the idea of racialized approaches to medicine.
Yeah, yeah. I would just really quickly add, and then I'll come over. Actually, I'm going to take another one because they've been in line a long time. But I mean, I think that, you know, this is why interdisciplinary research, I think, is so important. Because when you get into any institution that thinks that its mode of measurement and its tradition is the only way to ask certain questions or engage, you get not only a conservatism, but you lose significant insight and development. So I mean, I think the field of medicine has incredible knowledge that those of us who study race, say theoretically or historically, don't know. But when you put those two things together, now you have, it seems to me, really significant advances that don't threaten the credible legacy, right? So I mean, that would be a plug for seeing why things like Black Studies, for example, is so important to every other discipline. It's almost the intervention it makes actually illuminates and transforms as it challenges. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Marco. I'm the director of the Black Studies program at DARE. We mentioned it. I'm currently teaching a class on Assata Shakur, and one of the things that we're trying to look at as we move through the text is not only the things that you all have surfaced here, the things that come out of her text, but particularly the way in which power and profit work within those structures. And so we can see that in the prison industrial complex. We can see that in ICE raids and so on and so forth. And what I mean is the way in which economies get constructed around doing what we do to non-white bodies. The idea that the American system then figures out a way in a racial capitalism to profit from doing the things that we do. So it's not just about the disparities around race, but it's like, how is the machine actually profiting from that?
Right.
And so I would love it if folks could maybe talk about that.
Anyone want to pick that up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, it's definitely part of it's part of the larger system, and there's no way that we can talk about race and not talk about the economy and capitalism and the ways in which slavery really built this country economically. This country is a superpower because of the works of African slaves and slavery as an institution in this country. Even after that, we have something like the Bracero program, which was around for a really long time, for 22 years, I believe, and it was completely racialized, and it was sort of like, well, we need the cheap labor, right? We need this for this country to continue during the world wars that we were fighting abroad. So come on in, and the ways in which they sort of were cleaned, like literally, their bodies were cleaned with toxic sprays so that they can come into this country and then work in agriculture, completely racialized and completely, again, with this conversation that we're having about culture and biology and genetics and the ways in which they're mixed. But the ways in which, once we didn't need that anymore, right? Once people came back from the war, the economy was fine, we got through the Depression, you can go back now, right? or we're just going to deport hundreds and thousands of you back because we don't need you anymore. And the commodity of people, right? The commodity of property, the ways in which we can say, yeah, come on in when we need you, or you can go ahead and go back to the country where we've passed NAFTA and we know there are no jobs left, or we've moved factories and maquiladoras back to Mexico, so we know you actually have no real way in which you can live in that country. So that would be, you know, ways in which the economy really is part of an inherent part of the system.
Yeah.
Can I say one very quick
Sure,
thing? Oh,
sure. This
well,
was a
I'll
big
say one
question.
very quick thing, which is that the most powerful interest group in California is the Prison Guards Union.
There you have it.
If I can jump in, and thanks for the question, Marco, it's a great one. I want to say a couple of things about this, the ways in which there's a kind of political economy of prisons and policing in the US, and certainly we've learned a lot from the kind of intellectuals of the Black Freedom Movement, like Assata Shakur, but also the interventions of contemporary, I think, Black radical activists and scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore. You know, the best I know on the kind of political economy of prisons is her book, you know, Golden Gulag. And she makes a very important argument, I think, that the promotion of prison expansion has been promoted as a solution to these crises, right? Social and economic crises. Surplus labor, problems of unemployment, surplus capital, surplus state capacity, and surplus land. And that prison expansion resolved these crises. The reason I say that is that I think that it purports to solve social problems that it actually cannot. We're now in a crisis of mass incarceration that's unprecedented, right? And so here's what I mean. In rural areas around the country where most of the prisons have been built, right, it's been promoted as a solution to questions of unemployment, right? Saying that you're going to hire prison guards and the rest, right? Gilmore's book looks at a town like Delano in California, right, where you had unemployment rates at 26%. And they say, oh, we're going to resolve the unemployment rate. Well, they build the prison, and you go in, you measure the unemployment rate after. What is it after the prison? 26%, right? So it has been promoted again as a solution to social and economic problems that it's actually exacerbated.
Right, it's just extracting more human resources out of it.
That's right.
Tony, did you want to follow up? And then very quickly, because I want to get at least two more questions.
Yeah, I agree with Marco, you know, but I would, just follow quickly of Jordan, is to really say that I think that what then becomes important is to understand how the nature of what prison is supposed to do transforms itself. In other words, whether or not you agree that prison was supposed to be reformed persons, that's no longer the name of the game. The name of the game is therefore how much, what profit. So that to think about a society that in which certain things themselves are transformed, categories and the way we think about all set of things, you know, prison and so on, transforms into profit-making things. To think about, quite frankly, to think about a health industry that does not think through the human body in a certain way, but where there is really a profit-making industry. And that's how it works itself. So to then think about what kind of society we want and live in which that becomes the driving force of things in the society.
Yeah, thank you, excellent. I think I'm probably going to only be able to take two more questions, so I'm sorry about that. But one and then this woman here, yes, go ahead.
Hi, Colleen Kim Danaher, presidential postdoc in TAPS. So we began this conversation by talking about the spatialization of structural racism. My question then is, what kind of frameworks do we have to address structured racism on a global level? So specifically thinking about common sense racism and populations and countries that might not be majority white, but the way that whiteness circulates globally.
Great question. Anybody want to take that?
They don't have to be your frameworks.
Yeah, I stopped short because I'm trying to think, when you say global racism, what you mean? I mean, can you give me an example of
well,
because I have something in my head about global racism, but I want to make sure if we answer it and I'm answering you correctly.
Sure, so I think just in terms of unpacking an understanding of structural racism, which is what this conversation is about, how do we understand structural racism as a global phenomenon? So if your idea of global racism fits into a structural definition, and we're talking a lot about policy and policymaking and law, and that has been talked about at the level of urban policy, and a lot at the level of national policy. But we're also talking a lot about global capitalism and neoliberal economic policy, which we know circulates globally.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Jordan.
Well, I mean, I think there is a tradition of scholarship that we can turn to that has, let me say it this way, Black Studies has always offered a global vision, I think, to kind of paraphrase Robin Kelly. So in this way, I think that racism in the United States authorizes, right, the exportation of policies that are designed in US cities and can be exported around the world. So to give you a concrete example of this, part of my research is on what's called broken windows policing, right? It's first implemented, on a large scale in New York in the 1990s under Rudolph Giuliani and William Bratton, right? It is introduced amidst the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. It targets in particular the homeless, the turnstile jumpers, people trying to get onto the MTA, the subways and the rest. And it legitimates the introduction of the kind of criminalization of the everyday activities, non-criminal behaviors of the kind of racialized poor in cities. It's so effective there in New York in the 1990s that Bratton gets hired as a consultant to governments around the world, right? As a way to introduce policing and security policies, including in South Africa, right? Where they're similarly facing a question of homelessness and of tent cities. And you see the introduction of broken windows there. In Brazil, in the favelas, you see the introduction of broken windows policing. So in this sense, we have an articulation between structural racism and its practices in domestic spaces and those abroad. So I guess I wouldn't want to make too much of a distinction, as it were, between the home and the abroad, which has been, quite troubled, as I'm sure you know, by scholars across the disciplines. And so,
That's great. That's great. That's good. That's fine. Let's move to the left. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jaleesa Bryant. I'm a California native, and I thank you all for having this panel today. I'm really excited to ask this question. I had the opportunity to teach in East Oakland, which is a heavy drug trafficking and unfortunately sex trafficking area, and I taught in some of the country's failing middle schools. And I guess a surprising result from being an educator in that area is that I felt like I learned more than I taught my students, particularly because I understood the area a lot more because of what they had to share with me, because we had built up kind of a rapport and a trust. And so I also attended UC Berkeley, which I'm excited that you're here. But there I studied pedagogy, and I'm interested in studying culturally relevant pedagogy and how to get that to be implemented in more schools so that students feel more connected to education in general, but so that they see that higher education is achievable for them. And so I would like to know what advice do you have as educators for illuminating the intellect that those students have while not succumbing to what the status quo is for what's necessary in a classroom?
That's great. I want to just put a couple pieces on that fabulous question and then throw it to them. So, the way I'm hearing this question too is that when we think about structural racism in education, we often think about disparate budgets and overcrowding, but we don't often think about the ideology of education. The question is, what are you learning in the classroom? And are you learning about your own emancipation? Are you learning about the structures that might be impinging your life? Or are you learning really the very myths and ideologies that are keeping us stuck? And so with that extra piece to say, what are the ways that we can sort of intervene, particularly as scholars, right? We're in the classroom ostensibly quite a lot.
Yeah, and I think you said, I mean, in the classroom, and that's one of the ways in which, especially if you're the educator yourself, if you work on your own curriculum, it's one of the ways in which you can include things that are, that give students a different perspective, that gives students a holistic view of the world. One of the things I do in my classroom in terms of like, when I teach immigration policy, I don't start with 1790 Naturalization Act, right? I start much earlier than that. I started talking about American nationalism and the ways in which it was racialized to begin with. And prior to this country becoming America, right? There were people here prior to that and the ways in which they were racialized, the ways in which they were, killed off. And that sort of leads us to talk about immigration in a larger scale. But your curriculum, what you talk about, but also allowing your students to really come to conclusions on their own and asking questions that allows those particular students, maybe there are, for example, for me, Rhode Island natives, to really, localize the conversation in many ways. And it's one of the things that I do in my research, but really one of the things that I do in the classroom as well, right? So what's going on in your neighborhood, and how does that relate back to you? How does that relate back to us? And how does it relate back to the state that you live in, and then, your region or nationally, right? They're not disconnected things, but really linking that individual to their own, to what's going on in their own lives, and then linking it back to what's going on in this country as a whole. And I think that really allowing students to get to know each other and getting to know, this idea of space and place being really important.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps the thing to do is to think about a kind of pedagogy that some people have called critical pedagogy. In other words, there's a form of pedagogy in which there are two-way flows between the learner, so the person doesn't become a student and you then become the teacher, but there's and what one does is create a classroom of shared learning experiences. Obviously, you might know, through experience and reading, etc., more and so on, but the issue becomes how do you create an atmosphere in a classroom that allows the person who's the learner to begin to relate his or her own experience and ideas to the material that one needs to be studying. And that requires really careful planning, particularly at the level of high schools. And I would say to you that one of the things, certainly the center is trying to do is that we are actually working with a group of teachers to try and think, okay, how can we do a set of digital resources, teaching resources around issue of slavery? Because believe it or not, within the Rhode Island system, public education system, there's nothing about that. There's at all. So the question is, okay, how do you do that, and how do you do it digitally as well? And since we teach at the university, we don't teach in the high school, we are actually trying to think, okay, working with teachers and choices, the program that comes out of the Watson, we think about that. But thinking about that is not just us as scholars thinking about that. So it's really thinking about education as a form of practice and a form of trying to do shared knowledge. And therefore developing a different sensitivity and a certain kind of sensibility about what it means to teach. Is that?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for those great questions. Thank you. And I think I'm just so grateful for everyone's contribution here. This was a great conversation. I really appreciated it. Thanks for hailing. When I hailed you, everybody showed up. It's pretty exciting and an honor. So if you can join me in thanking our amazing colleagues here at Brown for a terrific conversation.